stiff on. Ooh, fucking with a nigga like me won't do. Left, right, left, right, left, right. Ayy, stop tryna get on my shit like move. Hit a motherfucker with a stiff on. Fucking with a nigga like me won't do. Left, right, left, right, left, right. Ayy, stop tryna get on my shit like move. Going back on dope like I might relapse, and that's running twice like I'm Andrew Jackson. Hop on the track like I'm jogging last, but I run the game with my shit intact. Won't collapse when I fucking blow, so I won't collapse like a fucking show. Fuck your reaction when coming toe to toe with the action, bitch. Keep the action, goddamn. How much more to the world jump off of my dick? Drop this shit and cough, and now you think I'm at you, man. The world is making me flip. That shit I be talking about when y'all dead be making me flip. Play shit like a
Okay. I fully understand what you're trying to tell me. I'm telling you, no. Hell no. Okay, fuck yourself, retard.
Assalamu alaikum, my fellow disciples of Allah. A new day is upon us, and so is another unorthodox build. This video was meant to be out a lot sooner, but then I got hit with the Shanghai shivers, so I'm very sorry to keep you waiting. I plan on taking a different approach with the format of this episode, so we're going into it strong. As you already know, Riki is a star of the show for this concept. This concept was submitted by the same big brain Giga Chad that submitted Eblade Anti-Mage. Riki with Shard and Meteor Hammer. Meteor Hammer lets you clear camps and waves without even showing yourself, gives good regen and lane, basically insta-kill supports with Shard. It's legit build in my experience, has worked as core Riki in 3 to 4k bracket. Meteor Hammer and Shard on the core role. Very interesting. Riki is actually quite versatile. He's able to play all roles very well, and he has a good win rate in all lanes. One thing that adds on to his versatility and potential in all lanes is the Meteor Hammer and the Agnum Shard. This combination has actually seen popularity in the past and became well established in the meta. It started off as a meme build and transitioned its way into the pro scene, and then it eventually got nerfed. However, the current state of his Shard is much more balanced, and still a very strong addition to Riki in all roles despite its nerf. So why have I chosen to do this concept out of all the others? Why'd I choose something that's already well established? Well, to put it bluntly, it's the base information that's given, and that's what I'm going to work with. And I'll be honest, I originally wasn't going to pursue this concept due to the fact it is already established, but I eventually realized that goes against the point of the way I intend to do concepts. No matter how established something is, there's always going to be a way to flavor it and make it unique. Riki builds, a bit like Anti-Mage, are pretty set in stone, and you'll only see minor differences between roles, like luxury items. So, in my eyes, this is a relatively clean slate to work with. But with that being said, Riki was quite challenging. I'll talk about that eventually. Right before we truly begin, another big, warm, and special thank you to the mid lane. You guys are all truly wonderful, and your response has pushed me further to continue creating more dumb shit to indulge with even more passion. Thank you. Who is Riki? What is Riki? How is Riki? Riki was born middle child to the great dynasty of Trap Lin, with an older brother groomed for the Trap throne and a younger brother, a struggling heroin addict. Riki, the small middle son, seemed born for the art of escaping federal police. It was an art he cultivated, and one which ultimately saved his life on the night that his clique was betrayed and his family clapped. Of all the royal trap line, he alone escaped, small and agile, unassuming. Using his fat clouds as cover, he cut his way out of Chirac, using the advantage of catching a fella lacking, quietly clapping up any fella caught in the wrong neighborhood, one after the other. Now free of his trap life, Riki uses his talents in service to a new, higher trade, SoundCloud mixtapes. Real trap shit. Sharpening his skills, hoping to one day make a diss track on those who clapped up the hood and robbed him his rightful place on the trap throne. So what have we learned so far thanks to the lore? Not a lot, to be frank. I'm just as lost as you are. But at the time of writing this, patch 7.31D has been released. So let's see what's in store for our protagonist. This is truly going to dictate how we're going to be approaching things. Crystal Maiden is officially creep. Pudge is literally impervious to damage. Our competitors got absolutely griefed by a Gopnik in the Siberian wastes. And Revenant's brooch has received a small buff and quality of life changes. Well, nothing of significance has actually truly changed between Eblade Anti-Mage and now, at least not in my eyes. So, what devious trickery do I have up my sleeve for our Trap Lord? Don't worry, we're not going through an entire Dota 2 masterclass. I'm going to simplify the majority of my theory crafting into a short story, which begins shortly after Eblade Anti-Mage. I needed a mental reset, not that sort of mental reset. I'm talking about a Pentagon authorized full memory wipe in order to carry out our next assignment. Imam and follower of Allah turned player and brother of the streets. And so it was time to start my work. I took my sweet ass time, trying out things here and there in demo mode and doing a lot of lore reading. I made very strange choices in items, but somehow, in some way, they paid off. I eventually stumbled upon a concoction that truly exceeded all of my expectations. Have you guessed what it is already? Yep, Revenant's Brooch. And as a nice tasty damage boost, Bloodthorn and or Ethereal Blade. Yes, this is very greedy, and I already know that. Being able to realistically obtain all 3 items, let alone 2 with a decent timing and lack of hiccups isn't plausible, but at least not right now. Now, I already know you Archons out there are a little confused, so let me explain. This idea takes advantage of Ricky's ultimate. Despite Riki not having a big amount of agility or agility gain, he's very capable of bursting down opponents upon hitting level 6. Revenant's Brooch takes into account conditional damage bonuses. So, Dash, Shadowblade, and Ricky's Cloak and Dagger for example. All the bonus damage added on by Cloak and Dagger will become magical upon coming contact with the back of a hero. So what does a 6-slotted carry usually have late into the game? Very high physical resistance, yes. But what do they not have late into the game? Magic resistance. You don't see a Phantom Assassin buying a Pipe of Insight very often, do you? So as long as you find the right opening during a team fight where the carry's BKB goes on cooldown and nothing else can stop you, you can hit them in the back with a supercharged DDS spec and send them straight back to Lumbridge. In the very late game, this combination does so much more against a majority of 6-slotted carries than anything else Riki could bring to the table. But you, my viewer, are right. It's not going to be as simple as it sounds to demolish everything in our path. There are many drawbacks to committing to these kinds of items. You'll have even more buttons to press. Riki will turn into even more of a glass cannon, which is why I'm going to stress precise timing in every action being required. If lane is fucked, you are 0 and 4, forced out of the lane and can't achieve anything else that isn't jungling, it might be game. The trifecta costs at least 75% of your average net worth, and so much more. And this is why Riki was quite challenging. But hey, the only person to blame here is myself for trying to pull Eblade Anti-Mage 2 out of my ass with this ridiculous trifecta. Also, by the way, Revenant's Brooch is starting to catch on with the Dota 2 community, so it's been very much a race against time to get this video out, but I digress. When I discovered this concoction, I played a fair bit of games over the weeks that came, all very fun and very toxic. Eventually, I got comfortable and fairly convinced by the results of my experiment, and so I started the second stage. We're not too far off from the end now. I'm quickly going to explain the bare bone minimum so I don't spoil any of the build. Weeks later of playing around with Riki and items, I began phase 2. This consisted of taking my results and piecing together an optimal guide and build along with appropriate expected timings, as well as what I think are the best extension and situationals would be. This phase was less playing Dota 2 and more staring at my monitor while playing Sudoku in the guide section. I did my absolute hardest to make this guide and build as unique as possible so it could stand out and not seem like a simple deviation from the most recommended build for Riki. I really did my best to give this Riki build the Eblade Anti-Mage treatment, but there was much difficulty in finding consistent success in specific build paths. Results were very mixed, and it was difficult to figure out which actions would bring a lean-loving lord the quickest stacks and fastest gats. The key for any successful build is consistent results, and with greed of this magnitude, true consistency was hard to come by. Reviewing the games and piecing things together really opened my eyes to something. Riki is a goat, just like almighty Sosa. The big difference between the two, Riki is a farm animal, and farm animals don't have a lot going for them. Their purpose at the end of the day is to be bred, slaughtered, and fed to the masses. Unsuccessfully pulling off a build like this will make that purpose come quick. And compared to Anti-Mage, hell, even a fair portion of the core roster, there's a lot of things Riki falls behind in. And the time I spent on this concept to make it unique, playable, and as legit as possible was beginning to pay off. But the issue of his frailty was becoming more and more apparent. So I eventually got to a point and started to truly think it over and began weighing my options in order to finalize this build, nitpicking every detail of my games and doing my absolute hardest to convince myself to not throw in the towel for this idea. And now we're at the end of the story. A bit of a cliffhanger, but why spoil the build? Now this is where the fun begins. I tried to do something special for this concept. I created 2 separate builds based around this concept for 2 different roles, safe lane carry and the off-lane utility. Both the builds I formulated share similarities but are overall designed to approach and play differently in the long run. We'll start with the off-lane build first. The off-lane Riki was designed in a way to accommodate for whatever your team may be missing, whether it be extra disables, crowd control, a carrier for certain aura or active items, playmaking and ganking, extra damage, eliminating backlines during fights, you name it. But before we get further into the complexity and intricacies of those factors, let's start off from the beginning. At the beginning of the game, you'll start off with the basics for any Riki player. Quelling Blade, 2 Slippers of Agility, 2 Iron Branches, and Tangos. You can swap items out for something like a Ring of Regen or Fairy Fire if you need extra weight in a certain stat at the start of the game. To get the most effectiveness out of Riki in the offlane, it's important to try keep your support in or around your lane until you get level 6 or at least get close to it. The reason for this is because of Riki's god-awful stats. Riki is built like a twig, and he can't solo and make plays by himself, and the majority of the time you will be facing a babysitter alongside the carry, so your purpose in life may come quicker than expected if you're forced to solo and you're not careful. If the support needs to rotate to another lane to help, that's all good, but do your best to keep them with you and not roam if every lane is fine. Otherwise, you may find difficulty getting your first few items and hitting your power spike. Once the conditions for your power spike are met, then both Riki and the support can worry about roaming. During the laning phase, you want to do your best to get last hits and farm as quickly as possible. You can opt for an early Wraith Band, but I would only get it if you really need the extra stats and armor to keep up farming against the enemy carry, or if you just need that little tiny edge during a kill attempt. Otherwise, the 2 Slippers of Agility compensate for your early lack of attack speed and damage, so that missing last hits doesn't make you go insane. I wouldn't purchase more than one unless the situation is that bad, otherwise you're pushing your next items further back. Also, you'll want to re-up on regen whenever you're running dry during the laning phase, so you can actually stay in the lane. Keeping up on regen will keep you around the XP and gold longer during the laning phase. I know that's obvious, but I only say this because not enough people buy more regen when they need it and they lose games. Anyway, buy a magic wand whenever possible too. Then the first item you'll want to be farming towards is Power Treads. Power Treads is going to provide enough attack speed and a little extra damage to Riki and turn him into a little bit more of a threat during engagement. After that, you'll want to farm towards a Diffusal Blade. I know, pretty basic stuff. You probably see it on 75% of Rikis, but Diffusal Blade is just too good on Riki to justify getting anything else over it. It is dirt cheap while being one of the most powerful items in the game for him. In saying that, while you're farming for your items, don't be afraid to make plays with your team once you hit level 6. You should be expecting level 6 around 8 minutes into the game. Once it hits 8 minutes, or you hit level 6, almost everyone else in the game should be too, so the map is going to start getting a little hot with activity, and that's where you come in. Riki is one of the strongest in the game during early engagements, so take advantage of your kit even if you don't have any items. He has potential to turn some bad engagements around if you stick with your team, play your cards right, and don't get too greedy. And remember, invisibility does not equal invincibility, so don't constantly play around the map like you are invisible. Be more careful and the stars will align in your favor more often. But when you're not fighting, you continue farming for your treads and diffusal. Once you get both items, buy infused raindrops, because you're not going to be sticking around in that lane for too much longer, because the game should start transitioning into what is called the mid game. The transition into the mid game is Riki's time to shine if all has gone according to plan. The enemy carry will be doing his best to keep on farming or start fighting with his team, and Riki isn't good at farming normally, so he can't farm as fast as his opponent. But we're not concerned about hitting creeps. That's our safe laner's job. Riki's kit is all about fighting, so that's what we're going to do. The entire mid game will consist of us taking advantage of our very potent power spike that is now further strengthened by Diffusal Blade. So our job is to kill, push unsafe lanes, and fight with our team every chance we get. The infused raindrop is going to help keep us alive during engagements, even if the enemy team doesn't have a lot of casters. Our job pays the bills quicker than farming ever could. It's the fastest way for us to obtain stacks on stacks and push the game into our favor. Don't forget that Riki is quite mobile and slippery, so take advantage of this to minimize deaths and waste a lot of the enemy's time. Since we're not going to be sitting in one place very often, you can pick up an Urn of Shadows if you wish. If you need to counter someone and your team doesn't have a traditional vessel carrier, you should pick one up. There's a lot of value from it for offlane Riki. You'll be raking in a fair bit of charges, and it can help keep you and your team alive when you want to keep your momentum rolling or even need extra DPS. You can choose to pick up this item in the laning phase if you so wish to. The next 2 core items on the list are the ones we've all been waiting for: Aghanim's Shard and Meteor Hammer. Obtain the Aghanim's Shard first, as it's much more valuable to you at this current point in time. Then, go for the Meteor Hammer. The Meteor Hammer gives Riki a real way to push waves, damage towers, and makes for a very clean setup with the Aghanim's Shard. Also, thanks to your permanent invisibility, you can awkwardly stand in the middle of a team fight and channel it. How fun. Now if you haven't yet somehow won, then you're either getting your shit kicked in all of a sudden, or you and your team haven't grouped up in a while. Anywho, regardless of what's happening, you've got some very nice choices to help you with your victory. Now the next few items I'm going to tell you are your choice. Everything from here on out is dependent on what you and your team needs. But there is one exception, Aether Lens. It's your choice, but to me it's extremely valuable for a utility / offlane Riki. As games progress, Riki's effectiveness usually stays the same or increases, and so does his weaknesses. The chances of Riki getting gunned down in the wrong block becomes more and more likely, and you won't be able to jump in headfirst to pop that support in 4 swipes anymore like you could in the early game. Tanking up and throwing yourself into the middle of a fight is for small brain meatheads, and is also the exact opposite of Riki's playstyle. So over time, our approach to fights will need to slowly change to be more reserved, stealthy, and calculated. Instead of constantly throwing yourself at the back of enemy heroes and dying to a BKB carrier, play around the sidelines, sneak around to the backlines, assist your team, spam out darts, smoke bombs, meteor hammers, and pick the right battles against any hero caught straying too far from the rest of their team. And Aether Lens genuinely helps achieve all this and more. After Aether Lens, I either go straight into the extension item Octarine Core, or build one of the many choices I have that also build into the other extension items, Maelstrom, Rod, Orchid, Mage Slayer, Witchblade, Vanguard, or Skullbasher. My usual choice is either Maelstrom or Mage Slayer. Once you carefully decide what you and your team need, then it'll be time to start looking at their finished products, and by that point, it's safe to assume that the game is transitioning into the late game. Let's be honest, in some games as carry Riki, you may not even see a full extension item being completed, because this hero can snowball the shithouse, and it's the same case with offlane Riki. But there will be some cases where the game is taking longer than usual, and if that's the case, we've got options, and a fair few. Like I said, this build was made to accommodate for whatever you and your team may be missing. Except for being a tank, but I guess we don't need to talk about that. Depending on what I decided on after Aether Lens, it's time to start looking towards extension items. Thanks to my usual choice being either Maelstrom or Mage Slayer, I'll be going for either Gleipnir or Bloodthorn. Gleipnir is an absolutely incredible item for Riki, and by picking this up, you now have a plethora of crowd control at your disposal during fights and extra wave clear. Bloodthorn is also an amazing option. Its passive and magic resistance helps keep Riki healthy against casters, and the active is incredibly strong and has strong synergy with many items. This is hands down one of the best items in the game. In this build, Octarine, Gleip, and Bloodthorn are my most highly recommended pickups at this point of the game. They're very fun to play around with as Riki and fill in all the holes that might be in your team's composition whilst possessing some form of status effect or benefit to them. There are 2 more extensions to choose from as well though, Abyssal Blade and Revenant's Brooch. You could consider them situational, but I don't. Revenant's Brooch is incredibly powerful late game damage against high agility carries and is a good counter to Ghost Scepter. Abyssal Blade is also an exceptional choice, providing some extra meat, bash, and magic immunity piercing stun. And that's that. Riki should have the necessary tools to help his allies close out the match. But if those weren't enough to clean up the game, here's some situational items and my reasoning for them. Orb of Corrosion. It's an okay pickup during the laning phase. It'll give Riki a small chunk of health, armor reduction, and slow to help you and your team chase, but a whole lot of nothing else as well. It's good, but it's definitely situational. Lincoln Sphere. As I mentioned before, Riki is not a very healthy boy as the game gets longer. This item will improve his survivability and gives a nice amount of regen combined with Meteor Hammer. Spell block being transferable is also a nice added touch for some pseudo utility. Drums and Boots of Bearing. Drums is a good choice if you want to keep the momentum and push down towers fast with your team. If you decide to go for it, then definitely pursue Boots of Bearing. Just don't buy Tranquil Boots until later to replace your power treads. Echo Saber. It's a very cheap and effective package with a snowballing Riki. Pick it up after a Diffusal Blade, and the passive of the Echo Saber will absolutely decimate your chosen target. When you're done using it, you can disassemble it to make a Mage Slayer and Agnum Scepter if you so wish. Dagon 5. Self-explanatory. Radiance. No comment. And that's pretty much it. Since there's 2 builds to go through, we'll discuss my thoughts about the builds and all the other details at the very end. Let's get on to the safe lane build. This is going to be a short one though, because we are starting off and progressing almost exactly the same way as the offlane build. We'll farm towards power treads, Diffusal Blades straight away, and run around and hunt enemies with the team till we get a shard and Meteor Hammer. So we'll be starting from the mid game and the transition into the late game. The main major difference to consider between the 2 builds is the approach we're taking. When it comes to creating something for the offlane, the main question I need to ask myself was, how am I going to benefit the team? As for the safe lane, the main question I need to ask is, how am I going to make someone uninstall the game? And so I answered the second quite quickly. After obtaining the first 4 items integral to the build, you'll either be in the late game or coming close to it. And so Witchblade and Orchid are the next 2 items on your list. Take the Witchblade first if you don't need an extra silence, as the extra DPS from Witchblade is actually pretty brutal. After you obtain them, go for your Revenant's Brooch and Bloodthorn. Originally, I was going to recommend the Revenant's Brooch first over the Bloodthorn, but in some cases, having a Bloodthorn is actually better than Revenant's Brooch if you end up farming it very early. Bloodthorn Bloodthorn has a lot more DPS than Revenant's Brooch in the middle of the game, while Revenant's Brooch will give you a huge damage advantage in the later stages of the game. And without a lot of attack damage or even a Bloodthorn, Revenant's Brooch will only whoop ass if you consider what you're up against. For example, Bloodthorn is incredibly good against slippery casters that can weave in and out of the fight, and will be a lot more effective against enemies who have high health pools earlier into the game, while Revenant's Brooch would be absolutely brutal against agility heroes that have high armor, and not much else that could get them out of a pickle. Thanks to how expensive the Revenant's Brooch and Bloodthorn actually are, they may take a lot of killing and farming to achieve, and it's possible to have difficulties getting them. But honestly, if you play a Riki often and know how to position yourself appropriately, you should be sweet for the most part. In other words, regardless of whatever stage you're at in progressing items, even if you finish them, you're going to play things very similarly to offlane Riki, constantly sleep targets and spam smoke bombs, and find opportunities to pick off the backline during engagements, so you can leave their cores on their lonesome. You will need to be a lot more careful than the offlane Riki though, as your team may or may not be relying on you for a bulk of the damage against their cores. Keep in mind though, the Sleeping Dart and Meteor Hammer combo, it actually synergizes quite well with the Revenant's Brooch and Bloodthorn, and decimates almost any opponent if you catch them in single combat without a BKB. Buy an Ethereal Blade as an extension item, then you'll be strong enough to actually bring down anyone in the game. This style of carry Riki feels like you're playing with the Divine Rapier half the time with how much of a glass cannon you are, because so much time and money is spent on these items. This build works best with very specific lineups, where the other cores can start or help you start the fights to keep the focus on them. That way, you can find the right opportunity to pull out your full combo and the enemy will have almost no time to react. But this build, in its most base form, doesn't do anything to fix Riki's fragile health pool. If you fuck up and decide to strike without finding the right moment, then you're dead after one silence or bash most of the time. So you'll need to play smart and wait for the opportunity to ruin the enemy carry and his whole day. But if you're struggling to keep up in a game and going for those core items aren't working out, or you've got all the items you need, don't worry, we've still got some options for you to go for. We'll start with the extension items first, if you've already finished your core items. Now I know what some of you original gangsters out there must be thinking. This build feels like a reskin. It's a little similar to its offlane counterpart. And hey, I won't lie, it is a little bit, but just because the first 4 items are the exact same doesn't mean it's not original. It means you're retarded. Hear me out though. If we want Riki to be successful in claiming his rightful place on the trap throne, he needs to stay scrapped in all lanes. And half you Riki players I see must be anemic as fuck, the way you stay lacking the iron. In all seriousness though, this build is still different enough to warrant an entire segment around it, and of course the extension and situational items reflect this. For extensions, you'll have the choice of Manta, Gleipnir, Skadi, Ethereal Blade and Moonshard, all a bit pricey and effective. Manta's main purpose is its Dispel and stats. Having multiple forms of Dispel on Riki is actually very powerful and should not be underestimated. Gleipnir will add another form of wave clear and utility so you're not entirely useless to your team. Skadi gives well needed stats to Riki as well as synergizing quite well with Revenant's Brooch and Bloodthorn against high health cores. You can also replace the Future Blade at this point so you can get another item. Moonshard. Riki has very low attack speed despite being an agility hero. Instead of going for straight agility, you could just opt for a Moonshard. This item fixes this problem entirely, allowing you to disintegrate your opponents. You don't need more agility to take advantage of his passive, you just need to hit them in the back faster. Ethereal Blade is expected. I was tossing up putting this in as a core item as it serves the same purpose in boosting damage like Bloodthorn, but Bloodthorn is more valuable for its silence as well as the fact that it actually allows everyone on your team to hit the target. It's not very often you'll have all 3 picked up in a game, so I consider Ethereal Blade more of a luxury item that will help you put the nail in the coffin during a long game. As for situationals, you also have some choice here. Some of these you can pick up before or after your completed products to help you transition into the later stages of the game smoother. Here's our first item that will help you transition into your extension items later on. Yasha and Kaya. When you're done using it, you can disassemble it and build Ethereal Blade and Manta style. Or if you don't plan on an Ethereal Blade and rather need survivability without obtaining a BKB, you can alternatively pick up a Sanjin Yasha. This item is actually pretty damn good on Riki and helps solve some of his survivability issues. With that being said though, BKB and Lincolns are also included in the list of situational pickups. You should expect to pick one or both of these up in 1 or 2 games here and there with this build. Keep in mind, BKB is not an item you should pick up early on Riki. It provides fuck all for him stat wise at his price, and he benefits more from items that will allow him to kill them before they even get a chance to kill him. Next we have some rather self-explanatory items. Dagon 5, Octarine Core, Abyssal Blade, Echo Saber, and Butterfly. Of course, there is more in the actual guide as well, which will be available after this video is uploaded. Since I made 2 abominations, I'll have to give each a closing thought and rating. We'll start with the offlane build first. The offlane build was never my original intention for this concept. The idea came to me towards the final stages of gathering footage. I realized my original safe lane build had a bit too much going on for it, so I made some changes and adapted it for the offlane. As the safe lane, I made even bigger changes for it, so I had to gather even more footage, some of it still lost. I actually like the offlane build more, and I think it's safe to say this build turned out a bit better than the safe lane build. It works better, it's more my style, it's a lot of fun to play, and it's surprisingly viable and ranked. Just keep in mind, Riki has mediocre stats, but amazing impact if you know how to position yourself properly. This build also works really well with a bunch of different team compositions and even some duo strats. Heroes I highly recommend using this Riki with: Lifestealer carry, Alchemist position for support, and Mid Husker. I feel like these heroes had so much synergy and potential for great engagements. And after the final rating, I give it a 7 out of 10, and I recommend it. I also really enjoyed playing the safe lane build just as much as the offlane, and most of my efforts were put towards making this work, but the Tribunal, they were right. It's way too greedy. There were games where it worked and it felt good, but then came the looming thought afterwards. Was it a fluke or did it genuinely work? And even though I'm a month and a half overdue, I still don't have the time to actually do an in-depth check. Riki is the kind of hero that if utilized properly can close out games early with heroes that can actually push towers, but with this build's focus and the pursuit of it in a game, it sometimes feels more like you're playing a 30-minute long plus coin flip. If it's heads, you can disintegrate anyone you want every 35 seconds. If it's tails, no comment. In some circumstances, this can actually be utilized quite effectively, so I consider this build situational. But if you're the type of person that doesn't care about being a serious gamer and you just want to have fun, use this build in turbo. It deletes any carry you can think of if they have no dispel or use all their dispels. Or if you're playing with a 5-stack against a non-English speaking 5-stack, definitely use this build if you want to see racially insensitive comments in another language. One thing I have taken away from this experience though is that I would definitely pick up Revenant's brooch as a situational item for the normal carry Riki, or pretty much any carry that has access to some form of bonus damage in one way or another. I rate this build 5 out of 10 and give it a situational. I hope you all had a wonderful time. If it's your first time here in my crib, then surely subscribe. Keep it 100, keep it real, and don't get caught lacking. 1,000 blessings upon you, and good night.